Hello and welcome to this session on flipping the focus, investigating employability instead of employability in international graduate employment. My name is Sandra Slotte, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor for Internationalization at Arkada University of Applied Sciences in Helsinki, Finland. I am also a PhD student at the Center for Higher Education Internationalization at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. And so the content of today is that I will do this short presentation for about 10 minutes about how I've found purpose in research by challenging a dominant deficit narrative. And then we'll close the recording because, I mean, I've agreed to it, but you haven't even been asked. So we will close the recording at that point, and then we can have a interactive exercise and discussion together here face to face. And we'll try to then wrap it up somehow and have some really smart concluding remarks. So in my work as a practitioner, I have worked in higher education for about 20 years. Oops, one too much. And in Finland, we have this national program for attracting and retaining international talents, including international students and graduates. And so my work has been focusing for many years now on sort of attracting international students and really increasing the retention of them in the country. So a lot of the discussion has been on employability. I also have a background as a recruiter, and so I've been quite surprised at what I found when I've been starting looking into both practice and research when it comes to increasing international graduates' employability, because it seems to be focusing only on the students. And as a recruiter, it's quite evident that there's two sides at an employment relationship where you have the employee and the employer. And so to me, it was very strange that everything seemed to focus on this individual. And even the definition that is mostly used for employability states that, this is about the individual and their abilities, but it's not supposed to only benefit themselves. It's also supposed to benefit the community and the economy and the workforce. So in a sense, we're saying you fixed it and we'll just sort of use it. Which means that if a person is not employed, we sort of tend to also blame that individual. We say, well, you have the wrong credentials, or we don't understand your credentials because they're from someplace else. We say, well, you didn't learn the language, or, oh, your CV is just done the wrong way. That's not how we do them, or something else that relates to the person. And so, it's your deficit that you're just not employable. And higher education institutions have bought into that narrative and sort of they're trying to support the individuals in becoming more employable. And employers are saying, well, they are not work ready. We want them to be more employable. And then, so this is a perpetual sort of system where we try to make that person more employable. But as we see in Finland and in many, many other countries, it doesn't work. We've been doing this for years and they're still not employed. So to me, this is sort of in these pictures, it's depicted the way I see it. So when I started looking into research on international graduate employability, it seemed like all of it was going in the same direction. There was a crowd of different studies, all heading the same way. And it was, quite slow to move on because it was very similar. And so for me, this second picture represents how, I mean, don't do this in practice, of course, but looking in the rearview mirror while you're driving is dangerous. But that's maybe how we need to also see things that what's in front of us and where everybody's heading is not all what's out there. We also need to look at the other side and sort of what are we not looking at right now? So what I started looking at was the employers. Now, I found this term a couple of years ago, and I just loved it because it's so self-evident that you have employability of the individual, but it also needs employerability of the employers. Now, I've been looking into what we could do about local employers being more willing and able to employ international talents since my master's thesis in 2007. So, I've been at this for a while. But this really caught my eye. And what I like about this suggestion, it's by Louise Morley already in 2001, where she suggests that we should divide the responsibility for employment. So not only putting it on the individual, but also on the employer. And only then can it sort of be equal in the prerequisites and the possibilities for all students and graduates to get employed. Because we find there are so many things about who they are that seems to be hindering their employment. So not their education, not their abilities, but what they sound like, what they look like, what their names are. And so these are stuff that you can't change. So yeah, I really, really think that this employability is important. And I tried to also sort of flip this. The picture was really hard. You can't really find pictures where international students are evaluating the ability of the employer. So I really wanted to make this look like a interview situation where the international students and graduates are, asking the employer, do you fit within our aspirations and within our culture? So flipping the focus. As I said, this is a huge issue in Finland where we're really trying to figure out what can we do to get these internationals to become employed. And so there's been a lot of different surveys to employers also asking them, okay, what would make you employ them? Now, the interesting thing is what they say is, well, you know what? If they spoke the local language, that would make us employ them. Now, Finland is a bilingual country with both Finnish and Swedish as national languages. And I think that this goes for a lot of non-Anglophone countries that they say that language really is the biggest issue. So obviously the solution would be to have funded language training, or then that somebody else just organizes the language courses, and then that would be great. But I don't really buy into this. And there's been huge amounts of projects and funding going into fixing the language. But we still don't see a lot of internationals becoming employed, even if they speak the language. And this was recently approved again by Ahmad, who did the same study in 2016 and in 2024. So it was actually really published just a couple of weeks ago. And what you see here is that he did one of these studies that have been done also in several other countries, but he sent out thousands of CVs that were basically identical. Now, this fake applicant was a second-generation Finnish immigrant who had been born in Finland, had completed their higher education degree in Finland, and spoke perfect Finnish, fluent Finnish. Yet, as you see in the graph, they were not employed or asked to interviews in the same degree as sort of native Finns, being sort of related to Finnish-born parents, because these people were also born in Finnish, but still weren't considered Finnish in that sense. But white Europeans were off better than, for example, than the Iraqi and the Somali. So really this narrative of, hey, we would employ them if they spoke Finnish fluently is just simply not true. And because the only things that separated the CVs from each other was name and mother tongue. This means that it's discrimination, and that is illegal. So I don't buy into this whole language issue. Now, what we face in my work as a practitioner, but also as a researcher, is that there's these challenges that we say, oh, but we need to attract and retain more international students. And this happens in many, many countries. We also know that employment is crucial for international student recruitment and retention. Well, then I hear that, oh, but our international students drop out because they can't find the internships or thesis work. And especially for applied science universities, where internships might be compulsory, they actually cannot even graduate without these internships that they don't get. Then we hear that, oh, our international alumni, they leave the country because they can't get employed. So although higher education institutions have done everything they can, they still can't retain them in the country. All right. So then we would hope to be able to address this issue. Now, then what we come up against is internally in higher education institutions, we hear that, oh, but you know what? We're a higher education institution. We teach students. We don't teach employers. Or, hey, we're not an employment agency. They really need to be grown-ups and find these jobs themselves. Or, you know what? We'd love to work more with companies, but we have been cut in funding and we just don't have the working hours to do so. We have to focus on tuition. So my question becomes, if we acknowledge that everything we've done about student and graduate employability still hasn't helped over the 20, 30 years, then we need to shift the focus. But then there's not really the willingness and the ability of higher education institutions to get into that. So I found purpose in shifting the focus from looking at the employability to looking at the employability. And well, it's been an uphill climb, I can tell you, because, in practice, there hasn't been a lot done from our perspective in towards the employability. It's quite sort of unresearched also. And so when I was trying to find a research gap for my PhD, I went ahead and found a research black hole. And as exciting that is, it was really difficult to pin down just one gap for me to focus on, because there's a whole lot that is not researched. But please join me in this black hole and try to make it smaller. So even though I have a very, very tiny bit of that, I would implore you to maybe look at how higher education institutions could support employers to employ the international students and graduates. And because it's always hard to sort of see and know what would others could do, because you're so entrenched in your own views and your own contexts. And so I went ahead and used AI. I used OpenAI's ChatGPT, and I asked it, what would be examples of how to flip the focus in research on international students? And I picked out 4. There's, unlimited amounts that it can give you. And I really encourage you to play around with that to sort of get out of your own bubble. But for example, it said that international students' language barriers has been studied, but how about instead looking at the institutional language policies and how different norms around the majority language might be then excluding some students and some staff? And, again, as a non-Anglophone country, that happens a lot. Instead of looking at the international student adjustment to the context or the situation that they're in, what about looking at the domestic students instead? I haven't seen a lot of studies on domestic students and how they react to the international students, but that would be fascinating. And how does that perpetuate some challenges, for example? Evaluation of policy effects. Wow, there's a lot of studies on that. But how about studies that would look into how international students have influenced those international or institutional or national policies? Yes, Jenna.
Well, no,
5 minutes.
that was just your 5-minute warning.
Yes, thank you. And then framing the international students as vulnerable, as struggling, and that's actually something that Jenna and Sylvie also mentioned in your first session of this conference. Then what about instead looking at how they cope with that, how they build their support networks, and how they advocate for themselves? And could that inform us then in different ways? And so this is where I would then sort of set up for the interactive exercise that will be outside of the recording. I would like to focus on 4 questions, and I mean, we don't have to, but this is just to get stuff going. But what would be the dominant narratives in your research that might be limiting, that really creates that bubble that you're in, and when it's hard to look outside of it? How could you shift your focus and see the other side of that coin? What barriers is there for you to do so? And how could these barriers be removed? So these are questions that I am throwing out sort of to anyone. I can put them in the chat after the recording has stopped. I would also encourage you to put stuff on the Padlet that I know has been sent out to people as well, so we can sort of collect your thoughts and ideas. But that is it for my presentation, and I will leave this with you here. And then for those of you in the room, please hang on and we'll have a sort of in-person chat here online. Thank you.